Before we begin, there's no need to remember anything. Simply relax your body and mind, slow your breathing, and let this tranquil tale gently carry you into tonight's dreams. Tonight we explore progress, but not the glittering kind imagine Alaska's wilderness. Not the postcard perfect untouched landscape, but a land scarred by crude oil and broken promises. Survival here is an exhausting endeavour. The tale begins with a vessel a monument to industrial ambition. It is neither beautiful nor elegant, merely immense. Built for a monumental undertaking beneath the waterline, the hull was a muted red, above stark black, with only the ship's name in white letters clearly visible. Only the white letters of the ship's name were discernible longer than 3 football pitches. Its width would have made the Panama Canal hesitate. Born of the energy crisis, this supertanker was built for a single purpose: to transport Alaskan crude oil to refineries in the south. She was named the Exxon Valdez, hailed as a technological marvel upon her maiden voyage. Her colossal propellers, driven by engines, roared like caged beasts. The bridge boasted cutting-edge radar and navigation systems. The sheer volume of her oil tanks defied measurement on paper. The vessel was considered a paragon of safety and reliability. At its helm was Captain Joseph Hazewood, a veteran of the company with decades of experience, renowned for his mastery of such colossal ships. The company entrusted this new tanker to him, a testament to their confidence. Yet dark currents were already stirring. Rumours of his troubles with alcohol on shore followed him like a shadow. Exxon had arranged treatment upon learning of the issue, deeming it resolved. Company policy prohibited alcohol consumption before duty, yet on the vast ocean such regulations sometimes remained mere words on paper. On the evening of the 23rd of March 1989, the Exxon Valdez lay at anchor in Valdez Harbor, Alaska. The air was crisp and cold, a blend of pine and salt dock lights cast an orange glow upon the water for hours. Warm, dark crude oil flowed steadily into the tanks, loading completed by nightfall. The vessel lay heavy upon the water, a sleeping giant awaiting departure. Prince William Sound was a breathtakingly beautiful place. Its intricate ecosystem, formed by deep fjords and icy clear waters, nurtured seals, salmon, and millions of seabirds. This pristine world had evolved over millennia. Giant tankers traversed its waters daily, navigating precisely along meticulously planned routes. Safety was the daily norm, and deviation from the routine would invite disaster. Seals, salmon, and millions of seabirds inhabit this pristine realm, a world refined by time into exquisite equilibrium. Colossal tankers traversed this natural sanctuary daily, navigating meticulously charted channels with surgical precision. Safety is an ironclad imperative. Deviation invites catastrophe. Aboard the Exxon Valdez, Captain Hazewold prepares to head south. The tanker was fully laden paperwork, nearly complete, the invisible pressure to keep the oil flowing ever present, measured in dollars and contracts. Just after 9 o'clock, guided by the harbour pilot, the vessel cast off. It moved slowly away. The first 2 hours involved cautious navigation through the narrow channel, the massive ship moving with a weighty yet graceful motion through the restricted waters. The atmosphere in the wheelhouse was professional and calm. The pilot issued commands, the helmsman executed them. The captain monitored the situation, all strictly according to procedure. Just before midnight, the pilot completed his duties and departed in a tender. The Exxon Valdez had now entered open waters under the sole command of Captain Hazelwood. The bow pointed towards the vast southern ocean, marking the end of routine navigation. Everything that followed would be subject to scrutiny. The sea never lay still. This was a realm where wind-driven waves and ocean currents intertwined. On this frozen night, neighbouring glaciers continuously shed colossal icebergs into the shipping lane. The Coast Guard tracked the drifting ice with outdated radar, striving to alert the crew in advance. Previous tankers had reported altering course upon encountering thick ice. As the Exxon Valdez now headed south, Hazelwood observed dense clusters of ice signals flashing on the radar ahead. The designated route resembled a dual carriageway on water, a northbound channel and a southbound channel designed to guide vessels through deep waters away from peril. A major hazard was the Blair Reef marked on all charts. The southbound channel maintained a wide safety margin west of the reef. Any tanker striking it would have veered significantly off course. Immediately after the pilot disembarked, Hazelwood contacted the Coast Guard in a measured tone. He reported the ice situation and stated his intention to deviate eastward from the southbound channel to avoid danger. The Coast Guard operator acknowledged and approved. On the bridge, Hazelwood ordered a port turn to evade the ice, simultaneously departing the safe channel. Minutes later, he commanded a return to a due south course. This new route took the tanker across the northbound channel directly towards the Blair Reef at its eastern edge, a standard ice avoidance manoeuvre. The critical factor lay in subsequent actions. The vessel must be turned back onto the safe channel before reaching the reef area, demanding precise timing and vigilant lookout. As midnight approached and the crucial turning moment drew near, Captain Hazelwood made his decision. He left the bridge, entrusting the helm of the fully laden giant to Third Officer Gregory Carsons, while the helmsman remained at his station. The rationale behind this move remains contentious to this day. Some claim Cousins was occupied with paperwork, while others question his alertness. Hazelwood made the decision that set the course for disaster. He left the bridge, transferring control of the fully laden supertanker to Third Officer Gregory Cousins. The helmsman remained at his station. The reason for this action remains a subject of ongoing debate. He claimed to be occupied with paperwork, while others pointed to his drinking hours earlier. Whatever the reason, the result was a catastrophic break in the chain of command. Third Officer Cousins, lacking the necessary qualifications for navigating these waters, now bore sole responsibility for executing a critical, precise turn. Hazelwood's final instruction seemed straightforward. Maintain course until level with a certain lighthouse contour line, then turn right. The captain then descended below the bridge. Time passed in the silent dim light, only the engine's deep rumble piercing the darkness of the Alaskan night. The giant vessel advanced steadily. Cousins watched the shore lights and radar, awaiting the turning marker set by the captain. Yet a supertanker's manoeuvre was no agile car. Each turn demanded time, covering astonishing distances. There existed a suffocating inertia. One could not command it, only negotiate with it. The cousin seemed to wait too long, perhaps restless or misjudging the bearing. The final minutes remained shrouded in mystery, conflicting recollections like a thick fog. Only one thing is certain: the turn was initiated too late. My cousin ordered a starboard turn, the helmsman turned the wheel, and the hull began its slow, agonizing shift. But it was too late. The vessel's immense inertia still propelled it towards its fatal course. My cousin ordered the rudder angle increased, yet the vessel still failed to turn in time. Panic spread across the bridge. He commanded hard to starboard, the maximum rudder angle. The helmsman wrenched the wheel violently below. The massive rudder turned, but it was like trying to pivot a skidding skyscraper. The force was too great, the time too short, the reef too close. The lookout on the forecastle was the first to detect the anomaly. Her voice taut with terror as she radioed the bridge, reporting the red buoy marking the reef. Its light, which should have been visible starboard, now appeared in the wrong direction. Cousins on the bridge glanced at the radar, then stared at the inky water, a sickening foreboding rising within him. There was nothing to be done now. The laws of physics had taken control of the vessel. For agonizing seconds, the bridge crew stood frozen. The colossal vessel glided across the tranquil inky sea like a silent steel missile heading straight for the heart of the reef. The impact was not a single thunderous crash, but a series of deep, violent tremors accompanied by the sickening screech of metal, scraping against metal, shattering the silent night midnight and 4 minutes the 24th of March 1989. To the sailors slumbering below deck, it felt like striking a high wall. Violent jolts hurled them from their bunks again and again in relentless, brutal succession. On the bridge, Cusins and the helmsman were slammed against the console as the deck convulsed. The symphony of horror unfolded. The low groan of steel bending beyond its limits, the shrill screech of bursting rivets, the terrifying wail of the giant hull being torn apart. The shrill triumph of rock over steel erupted as the sharp granite teeth of Bligh Reef tore through the tanker's single-hull plating. The hull's violent tremors abruptly ceased. Forward momentum halted, replaced by a suffocating dead silence. Alarms pierced the air, jolting Captain Hayswood from his cabin. Clutching his clothes, he sprinted towards the bridge. Those few seconds felt like an eternity met with utter chaos. Coons, his face drained of colour, delivered the brutal truth. We're aground. It was the very definition of understatement. Hayswood seized the radio microphone, attempting to turn the ship away from the reef. He ordered engines full astern, but the hull was firmly wedged, emitting only a groaning scrape that inflicted further damage. The first tangible sign of disaster was the smell. A sharp, pungent odour began to permeate the vessel, rising from the damaged tank below. It was the scent of fresh crude oil. It filled the bridge, seeped into the passageways, and hung heavy. In the cold night air, Hayswood stepped to the bridge wing and looked down, illuminated by the deck lights. He saw it. At the waterline, a churning mass of scalding black liquid was spreading outward into an ever-widening stain. That was his cargo now pouring into the pristine waters of Prince William Sound. A frantic damage assessment commenced with reports returning that were despairing. The hull was completely ripped open. 8 of the 11 cargo tanks breached 2, torn apart entirely. The largest oil tank was gushing crude at a terrifying rate. The Exxon Valdez was not leaking. It was bleeding. Reefs had torn a gash over 500 feet long through the hull, as if a giant serrated blade had sliced the ship open towards the sea. 22 minutes after grounding, Hayswood spoke again to the Coast Guard. His voice was unnaturally calm, laced with technical jargon. Valdez route. This is Exxon Valdez. We are aground north of Goose Island near Blair Reef. Oil spill confirmed. We shall remain here for some time. The phrase hung in the air. This understated statement stood in stark contrast to the torrent of black liquid gushing forth at over 20,000 gallons per minute. The pristine seawater was silently turning black. The crude oil carpet spreading silently across the strait, delivering venom and death to the thriving ecosystem slumbering in the darkness. In the wrecked tanker's bridge, the crew could only watch the disaster they had wrought unfold, illuminated by the cold, merciless light of the deck lamps. The tearing of metal had ceased, yet new sounds were emerging, a man-made plague advancing silently and inexorably. In the liquid stillness of Alaska's profound night, this colossus that had conquered nature was finally vanquished by it. The catastrophe had begun. 8 cargo holds torn open like tin cans, the structural integrity of this modern marvel collapsing in an instant. The immense weight of 53 million gallons of crude oil still warm from the pipelines began seeking an outlet. This was no mere leak but a massive hemorrhage. Black fountains gushed from the hull, primal oil surging into pristine frigid seawater. Over 200,000 barrels spilled within the first 3 hours alone. Picture a black river, a thick foul tide churning, spreading beneath the cold starlight. The crisp air, scented with pine and sea salt, was replaced by the industrial stench of hydrocarbons. This vessel, once a symbol of commercial pride, now stood as a bleeding wound in a fragile ecosystem. Initial responsibility fell to the oil company consortium, who devised a plan, a voluminous document detailing procedures and commitments, claiming professional equipment could be deployed within 5 hours to contain major spills. A perfect blueprint on paper, it proved utterly futile in reality. The first sign of trouble was the core rescue vessel, the response barge, being unprepared. Buried in snow, its equipment rusted and neglected, oil booms, damaged skimmers stored elsewhere. Crew members disbanded to cut costs had to be urgently recalled from their homes in the dead of night. As crude oil continued to spill and the team scrambled to organise an effective response, the promised 5-hour window slipped away, stretching to 10 minutes, 12 minutes. By the time the barge arrived nearly half a day later, the situation had far outstripped its limited capabilities, like tackling a volcanic eruption with a garden hose. The oil slick had already stretched over 3 miles and continued to spread. Exxon's convoluted reports deliberately downplayed the severity, attempting to manipulate public opinion. But 11 million gallons of crude oil could not be concealed. This black fountain signified not merely navigational error, but the total collapse of regulatory systems, emergency preparedness, and corporate responsibility. Plans had failed, equipment had utterly malfunctioned, and the disaster's cry had only just begun. What followed was nature's cruel gift. For 3 full days after the grounding, Prince William Sound was shrouded in unnatural stillness. The notoriously tempestuous waters held their breath, transforming into a vast, tranquil mirror as the wind whispers faded. In this extraordinary stillness, the worst-case scenario encountered ideal conditions. The spilled crude oil largely remained in place, like a giant dark pancake floating motionless on the surface. This presented a manageable challenge requiring no oil booms, the stillness itself forming a natural barrier. This golden window, a 72-hour window, offered the opportunity for a large-scale coordinated effort to contain the spill and remove most of the leaked oil from the surface. Yet this sole genuine chance slipped away second by second amid corporate hesitation, bureaucratic paralysis and logistical shortcomings. The failure began with Exxon's senior leadership in Texas, who were slow to grasp the gravity of the situation. Their initial statements deliberately downplayed the crisis, with one executive publicly assuring the public that the company had the situation under control, painting a false picture of mastery. Meanwhile, local fishermen, filled with dread, rushed their boats to the spill site. A standoff ensued between corporate and governmental bodies over responsibility. Exxon as owner, Eliza as operator, the Coast Guard, or the state government? No one knew. As minutes ticked away, executives, lawyers, and PR personnel descended upon Valdez, transforming it into a chaotic command center. Meetings convened, blame was apportioned, yet little progress was made in the oil-stained waters. The crux lay in a catastrophic logistical breakdown. The world's largest, best-resourced oil company couldn't find sufficient oil booms, skimmers, or vessels. Valdez's emergency equipment proved inadequate, designed for minor spills rather than the torrent from a supertanker. Existing skimmers clogged frequently. Booms were flimsy and insufficient in length. Further equipment lay scattered, requiring extensive airlifts to remote Alaskan locations, a time-consuming process when minutes were precious. Then came the debate over dispersants, chemicals that break oil into microscopic particles to sink it, yet remain controversial due to toxicity and the risk of transferring pollution to the seabed. Fishermen vehemently opposed them. But after mechanical recovery failed, they appeared the only option. Once testing was authorized, aircraft spraying dispersants flew too high and the wind carried the chemicals into clean areas of the sea. In the Gulf, the trial was declared a failure. Another precious day had been squandered. The calm weather remained a silent, mocking invitation. The oil slick lay within reach, yet the golden window for recovery slipped away amid arrogance, chaos, and a dysfunctional chain of command. While decision-makers in suits argued endlessly in conference rooms, the oil slick drifted steadily southwest towards international waters. like musicians playing while Rome sank beneath the waves. The clock ticked relentlessly, each chime narrowing the window of opportunity, until on the third day the weather shifted abruptly. The end of calm was heralded by the barometer on the evening of 26 March. The stillness ripped apart as a violent storm descended upon the Gulf of Alaska. The sky darkened to a bruised grey as gales howled, escalating into a hurricane and then a storm. Waves 10 to 15 feet high began to rage. For those attempting to organise a response, this storm proved a fatal blow. All already stretched operations were forced to cease. Vessels scrambled for harbour. Fragile oil booms were torn to shreds. This tempest was not merely a setback, but a catalyst, transforming a major accident into a regional ecological nightmare. The raging winds and waves acted like a giant natural mixer, violently churning crude oil and seawater together. This emulsification process spawned a terrifying new substance known as slick, a viscous, sticky, reddish-brown toxic foam, far more voluminous and persistent than the original crude oil. The total volume of pollutants surged 3 to 4-fold, with 11 million gallons of crude oil spreading like 30 to 40 million gallons of stubborn toxic mayonnaise. This foam clung to everything, carrying a foul, greasy stickiness. It coated rocks, saturated coastlines, suffocated seaweed beds, and matted otter fur and bird feathers into tangled masses, destroying their insulation and buoyancy. Before the storm, the crude oil was a single geographical problem, covering roughly 12 square miles. After the storm, it became a million separate problems, scattered across the entire region. The tempest roared like a shotgun blast, shattering the dark oil masses and scattering them to every corner of Prince William Sound and beyond. The oil transformed into a wind-driven tide surging from the Sound into the Gulf of Alaska. It raged southwestward with the current smearing thick, black sludge upon shores as it swept past islands, poisoning pristine coastlines as it rounded headlands, surging into bays and straits. Days stretched into weeks as the oil continued to spread, reaching shores over 500 miles from the initial spill site. The scale of contamination had surpassed the limits of human control. The containment window was utterly destroyed, rendering official contingency plans a cruel mockery. The disaster spiraled out of control. No oil boom was long enough, no oil skimming fleet large enough to tackle this catastrophe that had fouled over 300 miles of coastline. This stretch of coastline equaled the entire Atlantic shoreline from Massachusetts to North Carolina. Oil was no longer merely a surface problem. It had permeated the water column, the sands, the gravel beds of Salmon Creek, and sunk into the seabed sediments. This storm has woven Exxon's spill Alyssa's missteps and governmental paralysis into the very fabric of Alaska's wilderness. When battered tankers finally pumped out the last of the crude, the Black Fountain fell silent, yet the toxic offspring spawned by the storm now rage across the world beyond any hope of reversal. The crude did not descend upon this cold, silent realm as mere grime. It existed as a living entity, a predator unleashed in its primal form. Like a prismatic oil film, it was both beautiful and terrifying, shimmering with the venomous glow of poison. As time passed, the crude mingled with seawater, transforming into a thick, suffocating emulsion. Viscous as chocolate mousse, clinging to all things, people called it mousse. What a hollow name for this shroud of death beneath this blanket. Sound began to die. The first to feel its touch were the birds, thousands upon thousands who spent their lives foraging in the water, diving beneath the waves to hunt. For them, the oil was a fatal structural flaw. A single drop was enough to cling to their delicate plumage, shattering the waterproof barrier that trapped insulating air against their skin. Without this protection, the 38-degree seawater became a death sentence. The plunge in body temperature struck instantly. They floated, shivering, their wings glued to their sides, unable to fly. They paddled, desperately trying to comb out the filth, only to swallow more toxic hydrocarbons that burned their insides. As rescuers approached, flocks of dying birds, tens of thousands of seabirds, floated feebly along the shoreline, their cries gradually fading. Survivors formed silent, stunned lines upon charred rocks thickly coated in oil, awaiting the inevitable chill. Estimates suggest 250,000 seabirds perished in the initial weeks. Accounting for those sunk to the ocean floor, the death toll approached 500,000. The entire breeding colony was virtually wiped out, its clamour replaced by an oil-soaked silence. The situation for sea otters proved particularly dire. Unlike seals or whales, they possess no blubber layer, relying entirely on their fur for survival. This fur, the densest in the animal kingdom, forms a personal waterproof suit, trapping insulating air. Once stripped of this protection, the 38 degrees Celsius seawater became a death sentence. As their body temperatures plummeted, they lost the strength to struggle. Their flippers, caked with oil, clung to their sides. They paddled futilely, attempting to groom their fur, only to swallow more toxic hydrocarbons that seared their internal organs. When the rescue fleet arrived, flocks of dying seabirds bobbed along the shoreline, their heads swaying feebly as their cries gradually faded. Survivors formed a line of stunned silence upon the charred rocks thickly coated in oil, awaiting the inevitable chill. Unlike seals or whales, sea otters possess no blubber layer. Their survival hinges entirely on their fur, the densest coat in the animal kingdom, trapping air to form a natural dry suit. The oil instantly destroyed this barrier, coating the fur and flattening the roots, allowing the icy seawater to seep directly through to the skin. Disaster struck immediately. The once lively and agile sea otters fell into a frenzy. They rolled and writhed, desperately grooming themselves, only to drive the oiled deeper and ingest more toxins. Their liver and kidney functions failed. Their lungs work, eroded by the oil-laden gases, and their body temperature plummeted. Volunteers at the rescue center worked around the clock, repeatedly washing the animals with detergent to remove crude oil, feeding them via tubes and striving to keep them warm. Yet the otters died one after another, succumbing to shock, hypothermia, organ failure. They drew their last breaths in the tear-filled arms of the volunteers. Even among the few survivors, the trauma of the cleaning process often left them refusing food and swimming. Of the 357 brought in, only 97 were ultimately released. This harrowing figure laid bare the Gulf's catastrophe. Some 5 Zorro sea otters perished, representing a significant proportion of the local population, their bodies washed ashore. The lives of these once vibrant or users and guardians of kelp forests lay reduced to weary fragments. Toxins permeated every layer of the ecosystem, systematically dismantling the balanced world. The catastrophe began at the bottom. Oil suffocated the intertidal zone, where once thriving barnacles, mussels, and kelp were steamed to death beneath a layer of asphalt. Below the surface, crude oil killed plankton, the microscopic foundation of all life. Oil settled upon the seabed, poisoning billions of herring eggs laid weeks before the spill. Herring spawning is the Gulf's annual pulse of life, nourishing the entire food chain from salmon to seabirds to whales. In 1989, this sea became a carpet of death. Hatched fry emerged deformed, their spines bent, hearts malformed. An entire generation of fish was nearly wiped out, and the herring fishery never truly recovered. Toxins spread upwards through the food chain. Salmon returning to spawn in streams swam through oil slicks, absorbing toxins through their gills. Bald eagles fed on oil-covered birds and daughter carcasses, bringing toxins back to their nests to feed their young, causing a sharp decline in the survival rate at entire broods. Harbor seals basking on oil-covered rocks developed ulcers and neurological damage, With pups born at reduced weights and suffering increased mortality, the toll on orcas, the apex predators, proved even more devastating within days of the spill. The resident pod was observed swimming through the thickest oil slick. The following year, 13 of the pod's 30-6 members were missing, presumed dead. The entire population's social structure disintegrated. Another transient pod suffered equally catastrophic loss. A tightly -Nick family of 10 vanished after 7 members disappeared post- disaster, extinguishing the group entirely. Their distinctive vocal Italians and hunting techniques were lost forever. This ocean, once a cradle of boundless life, the very source of existence, now lay transformed into a graveyard. The scale of the catastrophe was incalculable. Over 1,100 miles of coastline lay smothered in oil, a stretch equivalent to the combined coastlines from Cape Cod to North Carolina. Yet this was not merely a stain on a map. It was a fatal wound inflicted upon the Earth's last remaining pristine marine ecosystem. This wound would continue to ooze oil for decades to come. For those living around Prince William Sound, the sea was not merely a backdrop. It was their life, their passage, their grocery store, their employer, their church. When the oil came, it did not just take the lives of animals, it destroyed the way of life that had sustained generations of communities. Nowhere felt this more keenly than the town of Cordova. Proud, self-sufficient fishing community, brimming with anticipation. In late March 1989, fishermen mended nets, tuned engines, and stockpiled supplies as the lucrative herring season loomed just days away. This first major haul of the year would repay winter debts and fund the entire fishing season. On the morning of 24 March, they awoke to the devastating news of the tanker's grounding, initially a distant crisis. The cold fear gripped the entire town as the crude oil spread. The fishermen of Cordoba did not wait for Exxon or government rescue. They were born to act. Familiar with these waters, they launched their private fishing boats towards the spill site, convinced they could contain it themselves. Dubbed the Mosquito Fleet, they prepared to deploy homemade oil booms, determined to defend their livelihoods. Yet they encountered the paralyzing wall of bureaucracy. The responsible company was in disarray. Equipment lay buried in snow. Barges were not ready. No one had decision-making authority. The fishermen were ordered to evacuate and wait. They watched 3 days of perfect calm, the golden window for containing the spill, go to waste amid sheer fury and disbelief. Then the storm struck, driving crude southwest towards their fishing grounds. Towards Cordoba, the herring season was cancelled, followed by the shrimps season, and the main event, the Copper River salmon run, turned into a catastrophe. Emergency fishing bans and plummeting prices wiped out the annual income of hundreds of families. In a black tide of oil, the town's economic heart stopped beating. While the economic collapse was devastating, the social and psychological trauma ran even deeper. Facing a public relations nightmare and a monumental clean-up task, Exxon began recruiting manpower and vessels. Its contractors offered fishermen staggering sums, thousands of dollars daily, to participate in the clean-up. It was a devil's bargain. Those whose livelihoods had been destroyed were now being hired by the perpetrators to take part in this forceful clean-up. Communities' fractured signatories were branded traitors, accused of accepting blood money. Those who refused watched neighbors pay off mortgages while they sank deeper into debt. Barroom brawls ended lifelong friendships. Proud, self-sufficient fishermen became timekeepers, obeying orders from out- state supervisors. These overseers neither understand the water's nature, nor heed the fishermen's profound knowledge of currents and coastlines. Disregarded, they are mere labor. This loss of identity, this profound powerlessness, is corrosive to the Gulf's indigenous communities. For villages like Chigaq and Totilek, this spill is the Chugach people's apocalypse. Their connection to land and sea transcends economics. It is existential. For millennia, they practiced a self-sustaining way of life, harvesting the ocean's bounty through intricate, sacred rituals. Their lives intertwined with the seasonal cycles of salmon, seals, caribou, and clams. The sea was their granary, their history book, Their spiritual core, crude oil poisoned everything. Beaches harvested for generations were blanketed in toxic slime. Seal breeding grounds lay desolate. Animals either perished or fled. Salmon rivers were suddenly polluted, the very sustenance that sustained ancestral livelihoods and embodied cultural identity became source with dread. State health officials issued warnings. Yet their advice was contradictory and confusing. Could the fish be eaten? Are the seals safe? Can the toxin-laden blubber be consumed? No one could provide definitive answers. Fear itself spread like venom, sowing doubt and suspicion within a once stable way of life. Elders could no longer teach grandchildren to read the tides for clams, for the beds lay dead. Stories and traditions tied to specific places now clung only to black, barren rock. This cultural extinction, swept across the land by the oil tide, forged collective trauma within what sociologists term a corrosive community. The influx of thousands of clean minus-up workers, Exxon's torrent of funds, and the media spotlight shattered the town's tranquility. Intimacy vanished, depression, anxiety, and post-minus dramatic stress. Disorder surged, domestic violence and substance abuse proliferated. The bonds of trust that held the small community together worked almost under. People sued one another and collectively sued Exxon. A legal tug-of war lasting over 2 decades only prolonged the suffering and deepened the rifts. This spill spawned a generation who felt profoundly betrayed by Exxon, by the government, and most of all by the sea that had once provided such bounty. Prince William Sound mourned lost wildlife, mourned severed livelihoods, but mourned most profoundly a vanished way of life. They knew that sense of wholeness could never be restored. From afar, the sea remained clear, yet they knew what lurked beneath. When the scale of the disaster became horrificously apparent, they tasted the venom under immense pressure. Exxon launched the largest, most expensive and most contentious clean minus-up operation in history, a frenzied, chaotic military-style mobilization. The tranquil Isles of Prince William Sound were choked by fleets, swarmed by aircraft, and flooded with over 11,000 workers dubbed the Exxon Army, housed in floating dormitories. From above, the bay appeared invaded, yet this colossal $2 billion endeavor remained shrouded in a fundamental question. Was this genuine remediation, or merely a spectacle built on pressure washers and paper towels? Initial efforts became a textbook case. In disaster management, the primary tools, oil booms and skimmers, were both insufficient in number and deployed too late. By the time vital equipment reached the oil-stricken zones, the slick had spread too far. Storms swept booms aside, while skimmers clogged with thick sludge. Ultimately, less than 10% of the floating oil was recovered, a battle lost before it had truly begun. Another contentious weapon was chemical dispersants, soap-like substances sprayed from aircraft. Rather than removing the oil, dispersants break it down into microscopic particles that sink into the water column. Theoretically, diluted oil is preferable to oil washing ashore, but the dispersants themselves are toxic. Moreover, sinking the oil merely shifts the problem to deeper waters, poisoning the entire water column and seabed. Though approved by the Coast Guard, turbulent seas made deployment difficult and effectiveness questionable. For many local fishermen, this presented a dreadful choice: watch the black tide engulf the coast, or allow toxins to contaminate the waters where fish breathe. The most unforgettable scenes of the clean minus-up were along the shoreline, hundreds of miles of rocky coastline, blanketed in tall ice like crude oil. Exxon employed high minus pressure, hot minus water washing. Teams of workers landed on beaches, laying networks of hoses connected to heating pumps to raise seawater to scalding temperatures. For hours, they blasted the rocks with scalding jets, liquefying the hardened crude and flushing it back to sea. Television footage was profoundly impactful. Charred, lifeless beaches were thoroughly cleansed, their natural hues restored. For marine biologists, this was an ecological nightmare. The intertidal zone, a rich yet fragile ecosystem teeming with life, was instantly steamed by industrial might. The process not only removed the oil, but also decimated all living matter, sterilizing the shore and transforming a complex biome into pristine, lifeless rock. In truth, the oil was never truly removed. Instead, it was often forced deep into sediments and crevices between boulders, where it would slowly seep out over the coming years. Research indicates that beaches subjected to such aggressive treatment require significantly longer to recover than those left to be cleansed by tidal action and natural decomposition. They recover far more slowly than oil miners contaminated beaches left to be cleaned by tides and natural degradation. In the name of restoring beach cleanliness, Exxon's army inflicted deeper, more enduring trauma, trading visible toxins for invisible, long minus turned baronet. In many areas, the clean minus up proved more destructive than the spill itself. The entire operation bordered on the absurd. Workers were instructed to wipe fist-sized rocks with oil-absorbent pads, while executives posed for photographs on cleaned sections of beach. Clearly, the primary purpose of this effort was not ecological restoration, but rather window-dressing for evening news broadcasts and courtroom proceedings. When Exxon declared clean-up complete and withdrew in 1992, locals knew better on warm days. One need only dig a few inches into the pebbles to see unweathered crude seeping from the surface. This potent residue serves as stark warning some disasters cannot be washed away. The spectacle may have ended, but the poison remains. The beach clean-up created a false calm, like applying a thin veneer of normality over a deep, festering wound, like a film covering a deep, putrid wound. When the frantic clean-up subsided, another battle commenced, no longer a clash of water cannons and oil booms, but one of cross-examination, motions, and the slow machinery of the American judicial system. This war of attrition unfolded in sterile courtrooms, worlds apart from the salty, chill and fell stench of crude oil. In the months following the spill, a storm of lawsuits swept across Alaska's coastline, targeting Exxon fishermen whose livelihoods were destroyed, indigenous peoples whose ancestral lands were poisoned, cannery workers, supply ship captains, and small town mayors all joined the fray. The plaintiffs faced a scale dilemma. How could lone salmon fishermen or elderly elders challenge one of the world's largest and most powerful corporations? Exxon's legal team was legion-sized, with limitless budgets and a clear strategy: delay, divide, and exhaust. Every claim was fiercely contested, burying individuals beneath mountains of paperwork, until they abandoned their case or accepted meager settlements. This was the classic corporate defense strategy, brutally effective, utterly soulless. Gulf residents forged a different path. They understood that only through unity could thousands of individual grievances coalesce into a unified legal force one Exxon could not easily dismiss. This gave rise to one of the largest and most complex class actions in American history. The legal team set about consolidating claims, striving to represent all those who suffered direct economic losses from the spill. The resulting plaintiff group formed a remarkable cross-section of society. 30-2,670 7 individuals: fishermen, landowners, business proprietors, municipal bodies, and Alaska natives. In the court's eyes, they became a single entity, their collective voice articulated through the legal team, officially titled the Exxon Valdez incident. To those who lived through it, the case was fundamentally a battle of the people versus Exxon. The pre-industrial phase stretched over a decade, with Exxon's legal team vigorously challenging the very premise of the class action. They argued each claim was unique, seeking to dissolve the coalition into individual suits and for each plaintiff to prove their case alone, a strategy tantamount to bankrupting the impoverished. The evidence-gathering process proved monumental. Lawyers conducted investigations across Alaska, amassing millions of pages of documentation, venturing into windswept fishing villages to collect sworn testimony, and compelling beaten fishermen to quantify the loss of their way of life in monetary terms. They had to prove not only that the spill occurred, but that Exxon knew or ought to have foreseen the catastrophe. The legal team built their case around a simple yet lethal argument: corporate disregard. They unearth Exxon's internal memos, shipping logs, and personnel files, exposing how the company systematically cut safety and staffing standards throughout the 1980s to reduce cost. The 1,000-foot Exxon Valdez was reduced to a skeleton crew. They uncovered that the company knew Captain Hayes Wolf had a history of alcoholism. He had undergone treatment, but relapsed repeatedly, yet still placed him in command of a supertanker carrying over 3 million gallons of highly flammable crude oil. The crux of this litigation lay not merely in the accident itself, but in exposing the inevitable outcome of a corporate culture prioritizing profit over prudence, a disaster that could have been prevented, yet became inevitable due to profit supremacy. In the summer of 1994, 5 years after the shipwreck, the case finally commenced in the Anchorage Federal Court. The jury, ordinary Alaskans, endured for months of grueling testimony. They heard fishermen describe the once miners bustling bay plunged into weary silence. Economists quantify staggering economic losses, and Exxon executives, under oath, admit to systemic negligence. The trial proceeded in 3 phases. The first established Exxon's reckless conduct, with the jury finding its actions reckless and wanton. The second phase awarded $287 million in compensatory damages, but the true contest lay in the third phase, punitive damages. Unlike compensatory damages, punitive damages aim not to compensate for losses but to punish egregious behavior and deter its recurrence. Plaintiff attorneys argued that for a corporate behemoth like Exxon, a few $100 million in fines represented mere rounding errors in its operating costs. To truly deter such a corporation, the damages must be staggering. They urged the jury to consider Exxon's profits and contemplate how to compel this global giant to alter its conduct. On 16 September 1994, the jury delivered its verdict. Exxon was ordered to pay the plaintiffs $5 billion in punitive damages, setting a record at the time for the highest punitive damages award in American judicial history. The courtroom erupted first in gasps, then tears, before fishermen and villagers embraced in silent solidarity. $50 billion, this figure seemed the very embodiment of justice, vindicating their protracted struggle against suffering. In that instant, the people appeared to have won. The corporation finally held accountable. Yet Exxon immediately appealed. The damages remained unpaid as the legal battle raged on for 14 more years, culminating at the Supreme Court. Ultimately, the Supreme Court slashed the damages by 90%. This great victory of 1990 gradually eroded over the long years of legal wrangling. For many, it became merely another bitter lesson in the imbalance of the scales of justice. Yet before hope was slowly eroded, the public and the judicial system pursued a more human-centered objective. Corporations are abstract evils, and the world needed to assign tangible blame for this catastrophe, to make one individual bear the full weight of responsibility. Captain Joseph Hayes would thus become that scapegoat. As this epic class action lawsuit took shape, another more focused, more intense legal drama unfolded. The court of public opinion had already tried and convicted him. In the frenzied days following the spill, he became the drunken captain, the reckless villain in his personal failings poisoning pristine wilderness, the perfect scapegoat. Worry and exhaustion etched his features, a face plastered across newspapers and television screens. The narrative was simple, satisfying, yet profoundly misleading. To divert attention from its own systemic failures, Exxon not only failed to challenge this story, but actively amplified it. Hayes was dismissed almost immediately, portrayed as a rogue employer defying the company's stringent policies. A complex chain of errors, understaffing, equipment failure, the absence of escort vessels, a cost-cutting culture was artfully condensed into the actions of a single flawed individual. In the spring of 1990, Hayes stood trial in Anchorage on criminal charges brought by the state of Alaska. The courtroom brimmed with righteous indignation, as serious charges were leveled: operating a vessel under the influence of felony, reckless endangerment of public safety, and negligent oil discharge misdemeanor. The prosecution deemed the evidence conclusive. Crew testimony indicated Hayes would have been intoxicated. The catastrophic outcome: the tanker ran aground on clearly marked shoals. Yet that infamous blood test conducted a full 10 hours after the grounding revealed his blood alcohol concentration remained below the legal driving limit. The prosecution countered with reverse calculation his concentration must have exceeded the threshold at the time of the incident, constituting illegal drunk driving. Hayeswood's defense team faced a daunting task: defending America's most reviled man. Their strategy was to minus-pronged first, to challenge the scientific validity and timeline of the blood test. Expert witnesses raised doubts about back-minus calculating concentration values over such an extended and uncertain period of 10.5 hours, a biological metabolic cycle fraught with variables, where diet, metabolism, and the precise timing of the last drink rendered the calculation speculative. The defense challenged the reliability of this 10 minus and minus a minus, half minus, a retroactive calculation, arguing that the biological metabolic cycle contained too many variables. Factors such as dietary intake, metabolic rate, and the precise timing of the last alcoholic consumption rendered the calculation speculative. The defense emphasized the testimony of the individuals present on the bridge with Hayes would during the grounding. Third Officer Gregory Cousins and helmsman Robert Kagan both testified under oath that the captain showed no signs of intoxication. His speech was clear, his gait steady, and his orders were precise and coherent. Though flawed, these commands were not those of a drunken man. The second element of the defense strategy lay in skillfully shifting responsibility rather than entirely exonerating Hayeswood. The defense did not argue he was a flawless captain, but rather portrayed a highly capable yet deeply troubled seafarer placed in an impossible position by his employer and let down by his crew's dereliction of duty. They guided the jury to focus on the critical moment when Hayeswood ordered the ship to turn around at a specific location to return to the channel. The third mate at the helm failed to execute the command promptly. Why was he rushing about, neglecting his duties? Why was the ship moving so slowly? The defense introduced sufficient doubt and complexity to dismantle the prosecution's simplistic narrative of a drunken captain. They argued the truth as lay in multiple intertwined factors, a chain of human error, perhaps compounded by mechanical sluggishness rather than a single act of drunken recklessness. The trial became a media frenzy, with Hayeswood daily navigating a hail of bullets from cameras and angry protesters brandishing "Lock up the drunkard" banners. Court proceedings were rigorous and protracted, with jurors hearing hours of testimony, nautical charts, steering orders, alcohol pharmacology. The judge demanded the global spotlight be set aside, focusing solely on the evidence. This was a trial of a man, not a symbol. After weeks of testimony, the jury retired to deliberate, the nation holding its breath for swift convictions on all charges. When the verdict was announced, shockwaves rippled across the nation. Joseph Hayeswood was found not guilty neither of boating under the influence nor of reckless endangerment. The jury dismissed the two most serious felony charges, convicting him only of a misdemeanor, negligently discharging oil to cause the largest environmental disaster in American history. His sentence amounted to a mere $1 fine and 1 hours of community service, the bulk of which involved cleaning roadsides and parked. Public outrage erupted instantly. Unbelievable. The helmsman had steered while intoxicated and received only a slap on the wrist. Many deemed it an unforgivable failure of justice, though no one was held accountable. The jury had strictly adhered to the letter of the law. Prosecutors failed to prove Hayeswood was legally intoxicated when the tanker ran aground. His errors stemmed from delegating bridge command to an exhaustive third officer grave professional dereliction. Yet the court's cold calculation fell short of legal standards, rendering the reckless verdict for a felony minus level offense an outcome of profound public discontent. The public was denied simple closure, and the demand to punish a single scapegoat shifted instead to examining the corporate stage set for disaster, an invisible entity promoting a manager with a history of alcohol abuse, entrusting him with assets worth billions, then turning a blind eye. Hayes became a paradox, both the scapegoat for the oil spill and a symbol of the legal system's inability to hold the powerful truly accountable. Though he faded from public view, he remains forever defined by that night of catastrophe. The true enduring legacy, however, is the venom that night continues to seep into the very fabric of Prince William Sound, even after the courts fell silent and legal disputes faded into the labyrinthine annals of history. The oil spill persisted like a latent poison, corroming the years that followed. Exxon capitalized on the public's desperate yearning for closure, weaving a narrative of the beach's rebirth. Television documentaries showcased soaring seagulls and frolicking otters, nature seemingly healing itself. Yet scientists returning year after year to the bay, and local residents, knew this story was glaringly false beneath the surface fairy tale. The seething reality was festering when the excavation teams delved into the shallows. Beneath the seemingly pristine pebbles lay a pit barely 2 feet deep. There it was. The shovel swiftly pierced the surface gravel, and the pit began to ooze a dark, viscous liquid, crude oil, thick, unweathered North Slope crude, emitting a fresh, pungent odor. Oil from the late 80s and 90s, trapped within rock crevices, isolated from sunlight. Errand waves, the very elements that typically break down beach gravel, had instead preserved the crude suspended toxicity like a time capsule. This was not merely an aesthetic issue, but a profound ecological catastrophe. Underground oil reservoirs continuously seep toxic compounds, polycycloaromatic hydrocarbons (PAHs), releasing fresh pulses of toxins whenever storm surges inundate the beach at high tide. Aquatic microorganisms, forming the foundation of the food chain, endure chronic low-dose poisoning through plankton, fish eggs, and larvae akin to a slow-motion death sentence. With the bottom of the food web destroyed, top predators will eventually starve to extinction. A slow-motion collapse particularly devastating for Pacific herring. Before the spill, Prince William Sound's herring fishery was the world's most productive economic lifeline. Each spring, vast herds of herring would surge into shallow waters to spawn, turning the bay milky white. This phenomenon was both an ecological lifeline and the pillar of the fishing industry. Ecologically, nearly all predators, whales, seals, sea lions, salmon, seabirds, depended on herring for sustenance. Dependent on passive protein infusion, the spill occurred 2 weeks before the 1989 spawning season. Oil-covered kelp meadows, the sticky roe laid by herring became encased in toxic membranes, resulting in catastrophic failure. Years later, it remains an unsolved mystery, still haunting the straits. Subsequently, the herring population failed to recover, barely sustaining itself for several years before collapsing entirely in 1993. The fishery closed, never to reopen. The once magnificent shoals had nourished generations of fishermen. Scientists now believe residual subsurface oil, through persistent low-dose exposure to toxic compounds, weakened fish constitutions, made them susceptible to disease, impaired reproductive capacity, damaged cardiac and immune systems, and may have compromised genetic codes. This highly adaptive species, thriving for millennia, ultimately succumbed to enduring toxicity. Its disappearance triggered a cascading domino effect at catastrophic levels, unleashing famine across the entire ecosystem. The consequences remain unclear. The herring population failed to recover, merely barely sustained for several years before collapsing entirely in 1993. The fishery was closed permanently. The once majestic shoals that sustained generations of fishermen now, scientists believe, suffered from persistent sub-surface oil residues. Chronic low-dose exposure to toxic compounds weakened the fish, made them more susceptible to disease, impaired their reproductive capacity, and damaged their cardiovascular and immune systems. Their genetic code may even have been compromised. Herring, a resilient species that thrived for millennia, ultimately succumbed to the relentless poison. The ecosystem's collapse triggered a cascade effect, with famine spreading like dominoes. The fate of the Gulf's resident orchopod illustrates an incomplete of narrative. Despite overall population increases, researchers observed several pod members vanishing abruptly, suspected to have inhaled toxic oil vapors or ingested contaminated prey. This population never recovered nor produced healthy calves since the spill. This functionally extinct pod of small orcas has been swimming towards its final destination, carrying its lineage to extinction. Since the spill, this pod of small orcas has been considered functionally extinct. The aging whales are swimming towards an inevitable end, their lineage severed. As a captivating flagship species, the early rescue efforts for sea otters similarly revealed incomplete recovery. Although overall numbers in the Gulf have rebounded, researchers observed persistent damage in heavily oiled areas, persistently high mortality rates and signs of liver damage indicating ongoing oil exposure even decades later. They continually encounter residual underground oil while digging for clams in the intertidal zone, ingesting trace amounts of cumulative toxins. The coastlines where sea otters reside also exhibit elevated biomarkers of petroleum contamination. Today's evidence indicates toxins have penetrated the terrestrial food chain. Invertebrates consumed by spotted eaters and seabirds display similar pathological signs in the same regions. The 2-decade-long legacy of the Exxon Valdez incident is neither a tale of redemption nor a chapter in disaster response and recovery. The wound remains unhealed. The fish are merely whitewashed. Crude oil does not simply dissipate. Most was burned off or skimmed from the surface. Yet tens of thousands of gallons sank into the seabed, where they remain isolated in the murky depths, continuously releasing potent toxins. This pristine corner of Earth, among the most beautiful and fragile, stands as a silent, eternal monument to human failure. It serves as a stark reminder the consequences of recklessness endure far longer than news cycles, court proceedings, or human lifespans. The stillness of Prince William Sound today differs from that before 1989. This silence is heavier, haunted by the spectre of the herring that perished. Low-concentration toxic oil still lurks beneath the rocks, biding its time. Alaska's imagery has faded over decades. Lobbying campaigns and dispassionate scientific reports cannot evoke that visceral nausea, that visual sense of a nation submerged in oil, otters drowned, birds encased in useless terminus-like shrouds, coastlines painted a uniform, savage black. These were not abstract data points, but irrefutable evidence of profound failure. This scar was not nature's doing, but negligence. Its scale possessed almost biblical force. In the corridors of the U.S. Capitol, inertia became the universe's mightiest force. Dormant public outrage first things. Its roar drowning the oil industry's whispers that had prevailed before the Valdez. The legal framework resembled a patchwork of oil miner-stained remnants, a tangled web of feculent state statutes, most notably the 1970 Clean Water Act. This system was riddled with loopholes, featuring laughably low liability caps that amounted to mere commercial inconveniences for Exxon. It was designed for minor instance barges spilling thousands of gallons, not supertankers ripping open their own bellies. Upon clearly marked reefs, legislative response began crystallizing around a singular, powerful concept once so simple, logical, and astonishing that it had never been adopted. The double-whole concept was no novel invention. Naval architects had known of it for years. Constructing tankers with a second steel shell within the hull significantly reduced the risk of cargo tank rupture. During low-speed groundings, the space between the two hulls absorbs impact forces, allowing the outer shell to deform and rupture, while the inner shell remains intact. Containing the crude oil, this elegant, common-sense solution came at a high cost. The American Petroleum Institute, the industry's powerful lobbying arm, had resisted the proposal for nearly 2 decades, arguing that unnecessary expenses would reduce cargo capacity and advocating instead for enhanced navigational training. Commission studies presented the facts to senators with quiet, compelling consistency year after year. Following Valdez disaster, the justifications rang as hollow as a child caught red miners handed clutching a cook each. After 11 million gallons of crude oil suffocating America's last pristine wilderness, no lobbyist could refute this legislation. Jointly proposed by North Carolina Representative Walter B. Jones and Maine Senator George Mitchell, the bill commenced its slow and arduous passage through the legislative process. Dubbed the Oil Pollution Act or PA 90, this legislation was ambitious and comprehensive. Its core provision mandated the complete phase minus out of single minus hull anchors from U.S. waters by 2015, requiring all oil minus carrying vessels entering American ports to adopt double minus hull construction without exception. This legislative revolution compelled a fundamental overhaul of the global tanker fleet, with the multi-billion-dollar equipment upgrade taking a generation to complete. The labor force of the 20th century oil economy, those aging vessels had become dinosaurs, destined for extinction. The act mandated that all vessels entering port must possess a double hull, with no exceptions permitted. This revolutionary requirement compelled a fundamental overhaul of the global tanker fleet, with the multi-billion-dollar equipment upgrade spanning generations. The workhorses of 20th century petroleum economics, those aging vessels, have now become dinosaurs doomed to extinction. This single minus issue act of Congress went further, addressing another major flaw in the Valdez response: the endless wrangling over cleanup funding. The paltry sums in the existing liability fund paralyzed critical initial response efforts in the critical first days after the spill. The Oil Pollution Act resolves this with brutal simplicity, establishing a $1 billion oil spill liability trust fund, financed by a 5-cent per barrel petroleum tax, creating a standby emergency reserve. This fund ensures federal clean up operations are not subject to corporate wins. No company can shirk responsibility by waiving a checkbook. The legislation substantially increased spill penalties, effectively capping corporate clean up costs only at the limit of their financial capacity. The cap on economic damages rose from a paltry $40 million to $75 million, though proving gross negligence remained necessary for actual excess compensation. Crucially, the law unequivocally reinforced the principle that the polluter, not taxpayers or state governments, bears the full financial burden. It also authorized states to enact stricter liability laws, despite industry opposition fearing fragmented responsibility. Endless litigation eroded political will, while the environmental legislation simultaneously mandated detailed regional contingency plans. Companies must now maintain equipment and trained personnel on standby, ensuring deployment within hours to eliminate scenarios involving ghost barges or missing oil booms. The legislation demanded tangible preparedness rather than empty assurances. Companies must demonstrate capability to handle worst minus case scenarios, and prohibited unauthorized entry of drilling vessels into designated waters. The bill's passage was far from assured, emerging after 17 months of intense debate, backroom deals and public hearings. The George H. W. Bush administration initially hesitated over implementing stringent new regulations, ultimately shifting stance under sustained public pressure. The memory of August 1990 remains vivid. The black tide and Prince William sounds still fresh in the mind. The Oil Pollution Act passed both houses of Congress by an overwhelming majority, free from the threat of presidential veto, signed into law on 18 August 1990. It stands to this day as one of the most significant triumphs in American environmental legislation. Its direct and unequivocal consequences stemmed from Captain Joseph. The law stands as a monument, declaring the end of an old way of doing business. It bears witness to a warning from a catastrophic event, one severe enough, ugly enough, and profound enough to shake the entire system to its core. The ink of self-minus reform had scarcely dried when the clean minus tripped victory on paper in Washington, D.C. left Alaska's pebble beaches, tranquil fishing grounds, and fishing villages scarred. The trauma is not merely legislative. Stemming the bleeding was only the beginning. The scars remain. Exxon's legal settlement was a complex tapestry, with dual civil and criminal penalties intended to draw a line under the matter. In 1991, The company agreed to pay $900 million in civil damages over 10 years for restoration projects, alongside $125 million in criminal fines and restitution into a trust fund. State and federal trustees managed scientific research, attempting to heal the Gulf. Another legal battle took on a more personal dimension. The spill had torn apart the fabric of communities. A class action lawsuit consolidated the claims of Fatito, Zorro fishermen, cannery workers, landowners, and Alaska natives whose livelihoods had been devastated. This struggle was not merely about ecological restoration, it was about rebuilding livelihoods. In 1994, after months of hearings, an Anchorage jury found Exxon acted with reckless disregard and awarded plaintiffs a staggering $5 billion in punitive damages, a sum intended to deter and send a warning to corporate boards worldwide. This David Minus versus Minus Goliath moment of justice proved fleeting, leveraging its vast financial resources to overpower the state of Alaska. Exxon immediately launched a legal war of attrition appeals, counter Minus appeals, and 15 years of entanglement within the labyrinthine U.S. judicial system. The case concerning punitive damages was appealed 3 times to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals before finally reaching the Supreme Court. This protracted legal battle became a background radiations force in people's lives. Residents of Prince William Sound endured daily exposure to low-dose uncertainty. The hopes of 1990 for gradually crystallized into bitter cynicism. The compensation, intended to aid reconstruction, instead became a source of deep division. Local media began using the toxic term oil barons to describe those potentially receiving substantial payouts, breeding envy and resentment that turned neighbors against each other and fractured families. Some households accepted early, modest settlements to make ends meet, while others persisted with the class action, convinced justice would ultimately prevail. As time passed, social cohesion gradually eroded. Towns like Kodiak, once united by mutual aid, saw the shared hardships that should have forged strong bonds begin to crack. The prolonged wait exhausted too many, but by the time the legal verdicts were finally settled, over 8,000 of the original 4 plaintiffs had passed away. Fishermen lost their vessels. Indigenous elders severed ties with ancestral waters. Businesses went bankrupt, and some passed away while awaiting compensation. In 2008, the U.S. Supreme Court ended the dispute with a contentious 5-3 ruling, deeming the original $500 million award excessive and slashing it by 90% to just over $50 million, divided among roughly 15,000 claimants. The compensation for a single season's lost fishing income from 2 decades prior became a final, humiliating twist. The money eventually arrived, yet felt more like charity than justice. Amid weary sighs, the legal system had drained everyone's strength, while the intergenerational trauma ran deeper than any financial ledger. The people of this land endure high rates of anxiety, depression and post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms often associated with war veterans, survivors of violent crime and those who have witnessed death. When the world shatters, a part of the soul crumbles with it. Most excruciating is the loss of trust in the oil industry, in the government that should have protected its people, in the courts that should have delivered justice. Most heartbreaking is the very sound of Prince William Sound, which 4 generations nurtured life. That waterway, once steaming with vitality and abundance, now regarded by many as a crime scene of sorrow following the oil spill. The rhythms of the tides, the secrets of the bay, the mysteries of every inlet and estuary, now gaze upon the water with suspicion. Declarations that the fish are safe to eat, promises that the herring will return, all feel chillingly hollow. After the spill, many regard this magnificent place as a sorrowful crime scene, a constant reminder of the fishermen lost, having spent their lives studying tidal rhythms and bay secrets. They now regard the sea with wariness, uncertain when they might fish with peace of mind, or if the herring will ever return. The herring population, the cornerstone of the entire marine food chain, collapsed after the accident and has failed to recover for years. Though the salmon fishery eventually revived, This intricate web of life has been torn apart. Scientists still strive to unravel the trauma endured by indigenous peoples the Skagway, Aleut, and Tlingit, whose cultural foundations, spiritual beliefs, and very sense of identity, vital bonds for well-being, were shattered by this catastrophe. The spill was not merely an environmental disaster, but a cultural catastrophe, its ever sacred bonds stretching back millennia. The marine food chain sustaining hundreds of generations, clams, mussels, seals, and seaweed now endure contamination by persistent, invisible toxins. Keepers of traditional knowledge no longer gaze upon the sea. The transmission of stories, songs, and customs to younger generations hangs in the balance. The knowledge of teaching children to gather on the shore may now impart deadly risk. The way of life has become unsustainable. This catastrophe has accelerated the erosion of cultural extinction, its damage far more profound and enduring than any economic collapse. Commercial fishing face the plight of stolen heritage. Their memories corroded by venom. Crude oil settles on the pebble beaches, and also settles deep within the collective soul. People have become an art chapter in history, now gone, between parents and children. A cautionary tale whispers in the wind. Intergenerational trauma lurks beneath the surface. To this day, digging a few inches into the shore reveals crude oil. Prince William Sound appears clean on the surface. Yet the poison remains. The Exxon Valdez incident is not over. Alaska, in Quartzendon beaches, continues to send out ripples, echoes in the water. The year became the benchmark for modern environmental disasters. The 0 point. Every subsequent spill, every pipeline rupture, every tanker accident is measured against Valdez. A byword for corporate arrogance, a global symbol of ecological catastrophe, a powerful metaphor for a noble minus-level disaster. The Hoppe or disaster occupies a unique place in collective memory, its imagery vivid and brutal, not colorless as gas, but formless pollutants, viscous black primordial sludge seeping into groundwater. This substance haunts ancient past, sustains the present, yet suffocates the future. A thriving ecosystem transformed in a motion catastrophe on television screens, dominating evening news for months. This forced confrontation compelled people to confront the truth every time we fill up our tanks, board a plane, or enter the invisible network connecting our world. The seamless convenience of modern life conceals the price Prince William Sound paid for our energy. The Valdez disaster chronicled Doyle's death in black and white. The cautionary tale that should have been etched into the Oil Pollution Act of 1990 failed to prevent history repeating itself. The unequivocal warnings of the 1990 seconds compelled us never to repeat the same mistakes. Today, double-minus-hulled tankers stand as the global standard, the direct outcome of that lesson. Undeniably, while safer systems are not foolproof, they have averted countless spills. The echoes of the Blair Reef grow ever more jarring. The catastrophe that descended on 20 April 2010 no longer unfolded in Alaska's frigid waters, but in the warm deep currents of the Gulf of Mexico. Bearing a new name, Deepwater Horizon, the specifics differed. The tanker became an offshore drilling rig, and the disaster erupted when a stranded wellhead spewed oil, triggering catastrophic explosions. The eerily familiar melody stemmed from a cascade of preventable human and technical errors, compounded by a corporate culture that prioritized speed and cost cutting over safety. The catastrophic failure of a critical safety device, the blowout preventer, meant, like a deep-C version of the Exxon Valdez, the second layer of protection was absent. The clumsy and inadequate initial response highlighted a profound sense of helplessness in the face of catastrophe. Crude oil gushed like a torrent from the vessel's depths, surging continuously for miles below the sea surface. The Deepwater Horizon spill far exceeded the Valdez in every quantifiable metric, 20 times the volume, lasting 80-7 days, contaminating a broader expanse of commercially sensitive waters, and devastating fisheries and coastal economies across 5 states. Yet the public reaction was starkly different. Perhaps it was a weary world numbed by a fragmented media landscape, or perhaps a crisis fatigue. More likely, it was a disturbing sense of fatalism, treating the event as an anomaly. The inevitable systemic cost and insatiable demand for fossil fuels. Live broadcasts of gushing oil wells, witnessed with a somber fascination and helplessness. Heartbreaking images repeated oil miners, soaked pelicans replacing sea otters. Hearing the same bureaucratic platitudes. Executives from BP to Exxon repeating identical promises of remediation. Prolonged litigation continues. Compensation still echoing. An undeniable history, not a rhyming poetry, but verses perpetually replayed. The Exxon Valdez incident harbors an ambiguous dual narrative, both a disaster of progress and the direct catalyst for stricter regulations and safer technologies. It proves public outrage can exceptionally bend the arc of history, yet equally reveals the narrative's limitations. The story, even stringent regulations, good people and corporations bearing missions. Subsequent accountability unveils corporate responsibility, mobilizing vast legal funds. Global energy giants undergo a slow, painful the victims' questions hung in the still night air. The true cost lifestyles measured in barrels of oil, dollar prices, quarterly reports. The Valdez demanded a different scale. The price of lost fishing seasons, herring never to return. Elders fell silent, no longer teaching grandchildren the tides. The toxicity on distant shores outlived us all. Man-minus made disaster. God's hand, commerce's fruit. Hundreds of shortcuts taken in countless decisions. Warnings ignored. Drowned by collective greed. A torrent of cheap energy. A black wave engulfing Prince William Sound. Spring 1989. More spilled crude oil, like a dark mirror reflecting civilization, exposing its fragile, fatal consequences. Drifting independence, perhaps hearing faint echoes across the years. The groan of steel and rock, the reverberation of water, reminding us of debts yet to be repaid. Debt. When this silent tale concludes, you need do nothing more. If you have already drifted into slumber, may this tranquil moment gently linger through the night. If you still toss and turn, you are welcome to rest here, and stay as low as you wish.